Hey everyone, this is Mr. Krieger again, and I get to teach you guys about the amazing Pacific Northwest Native Americans and the Arctic Native Americans. And so I'm going to show you on a map where these are located, and I'm very familiar with this region. I lived out there for quite some time and got to enjoy its beauty. And so when we talk about the Pacific Northwest Native Americans, guys, we're talking about the area here, Oregon, up to Washington, and then even southern parts of Canada. And most tribes lived near the coast because they used the Pacific Ocean for all of its resources of fish and whale and seal. And then here in a little bit, we'll discuss the Arctic Native Americans. And I'm talking about up here a little farther north in Alaska and northern Canada. So let's first talk about their shelters. And so this is somewhat similar to the eastern woodlands because these were also longhouses or plank houses of the Pacific Northwest. And they were surrounded by these huge, dense forests that contained so many trees, and the trees were some of the biggest in the world. And if you guys remember, we kind of talked about that previously, how big these trees and how old they lived to be. So with all these trees nearby, it was easy for them to harvest, to cut them down, to turn them into these beautiful plank houses or longhouses. And here you can see the interior of a longhouse. And over here, the longhouse has some gorgeous totem poles outside, which they also carved from the huge fir trees there. Speaking of totem pole, here's one example, and these are so gorgeous. Just the amount of detail and the color. This is very well sculpted and carved out of wood. And so these totem poles actually had some big symbolism in the sense that these animals or characters and creatures and humans and even insects are what they put on these totem poles, and they were to represent the family's status, like how the family was looked upon in the community. And usually, up top was a bird of some type. You might have a raven or an eagle, and that usually kind of identified the tribe that was living there. And totem poles are read from bottom to top. And so at the bottom, these usually symbolize the homeowner and the type of status that they had within the community. If they were very popular and very well known and had power and wealth, they had some really cool symbols and creatures and animals that they carved and painted into these totem poles. And like I said, these were found right outside of their houses, and sometimes outside of the community where the tribe lived. And the natural resources. So obviously we talked about the dense forest. That means there's just a ton of trees in a certain area. And they used all of these trees for their shelter, for tools, weapons, even clothing. Animals lived amongst these woods. They built their canoes out of these. Nuts and berries grew in this area. And the canoe thing is one of the cooler stories. I love how they were able to, once they cut down these huge trees, they were able to take what is called a controlled fire, a fire that they would actually start and maintain. And they would start this fire on top of this huge log, and it would slowly start to burn, and they would use a scraping tool and start carving it out while it was burning. It just made the wood softer. So they were able to make a canoe in such a quicker and easier time than if they didn't have that fire. And so it was a very cool method that they used. And eventually the fire and scraping it away, they would get the entire inside of the canoe would be done. And then they would just have to kind of carve the outside and make sure that it was a vessel that was buoyant and was able to be kind of speedy because they were using it to fish and to chase whales and seals to hunt. And then over here, this is the Pacific Ocean, very beautiful, just abundant of life, of fish, whales, seals, even shellfish. So they used the Pacific Ocean and the tributaries that would take fish and other species into the Pacific Ocean. So these tributaries are the rivers and streams that would flow into it. And if you remember, we discussed that a few weeks ago. And I'm going to talk to you about the salmon that would that would go up these tributaries. So I showed you the dense forests and everything they used them for, the Pacific Ocean and its tributaries. And salmon is one of the most popular and abundant fish in the Pacific Northwest. And it's different than the Atlantic salmon. And so here is a king salmon, probably about 50 pounds. So you can imagine the amount of meat that would come off of just that one fish. Well, the salmon life cycle, how it works is that salmon are born in freshwater. So they're born in a stream or a river, and they'll stay in this river and stream for a couple of years till they're big enough and strong enough to fight their way out to the Pacific Ocean. Then they get out to the Pacific Ocean and they'll spend a couple of years out there getting stronger, getting mature enough to be able to lay eggs in what is a process we call spawning. And so what they do when they spawn is they will swim from the Pacific Ocean back to where they were born. And it's so cool. It's innate. They just know to do it. So they go back to exactly where they were born and they will lay their eggs there. And when they're doing that, there's millions and millions of salmon that are going at the same time. So you can imagine how easy that would be for the Native Americans to fish them. I've seen it in person. I love salmon. I love fishing. I love the taste of salmon. I could eat it any which way that the Native Americans did. And so I loved salmon fishing, and I'd seen this before where when they spawn, there's so many of them that you can hardly even see water. It's just fish. And I've heard stories that Native Americans, it was so thick with salmon that they could walk across a stream or a river on the backs of the fish and not even get their moccasins wet. And to me, that's just one of the coolest stories because I love salmon. And one other quick story about salmon. So hopefully your teachers will teach you guys about Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea or Sagagia is how she should be pronounced. Anyway, I'm sure you guys have heard of them. But there's a story when they were exploring all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. They started in the Midwest. They started in St. Louis, and they went out to the West to explore because no one had been out there, just Native Americans. And so when they finally got out there, they were hungry, they were tired, and the Native Americans were very friendly and offered them salmon. Well, some of the explorers that were with Lewis and Clark had never seen Pacific salmon, didn't know what salmon was. They were only used to fish that have white meat, like bluegill and crappie and catfish. But salmon look way different. And when you see their meat, it's a really dark pink, almost red. And it kind of freaked out the expedition. So all these guys saw it and then they smelled it and they were kind of grossed out by it. So grossed out and they were so hungry that they actually offered to buy some of the dogs from the Native Americans. And they would have rather eaten dog than salmon. And that blows me away because I'm a salmon lover and a dog lover. All right, now let's talk about their culture. So the culture in the Pacific Northwest is quite different than anyone else because of the surplus amount of supplies out there that they had. The trees, the fish, the salmon, the elk, the deer, everything was right within reach, and they lived so close to everything that they really didn't have to exert a lot of energy. And so they were able to have leisure time, meaning they were able to play and dance and they did play fighting and had celebrations. And they did that with their large extended family or their clan. And they also lived in those same longhouses, kind of like they did in the Eastern Woodlands. You could have a very large extended family, up to maybe 50 people living in one of their longhouses. And another very cool celebration was called that potlatch. And this was a time that that's usually some of the elders that had a lot of wealth, meaning they had a lot of food, they had a lot of jewelry and masks and other gifts to give away. They would invite everybody over, have a huge spread of food, have a great time. Music would be playing. They would have a blast, and they would start giving away a lot of their property. And that was just to show everybody, hey, I'm so rich, I am so wealthy, I have all this, I don't need all this. So they would give that away. And the people that were higher status rankings, so that were more important in the community, they received more gifts and better gifts than the others. And so to me, I just think that's such a neat idea in the sense that it brought them together, it brought them close, and they got to celebrate. and have a good time and show off everything. Like I said, they had plenty of leisure time because everything was right there. It was easy to go. You could stroll down to the stream and grab a salmon. Your day was done. You had food for everybody. So then you could go back and play games and dance. And the flathead appearance, this, not every Native American tribe out there was like this, but many of them were. And what I mean by flathead appearance, this was actually a look that they purposely did. When the kids, or I guess when they were babies, infants, a month or 2 years old, the parents would strap a board across their forehead, and they would strap it to their little bassinet or their little cradle that they would be carried around in, and they would wear that on their forehead. And it didn't hurt the kids. At that age, your bone was a lot softer and more malleable, meaning it could kind of move and expand and do what you wanted it to, and it didn't hurt. And they would do that with their children up until they were about almost a year old, and that would give them this very, very flat head. And to them, they wanted to be different than other Native Americans. They thought it was very beautiful. They thought it was super cool. Just like many other cultures have different ideas of beauty, that was their idea of beauty, and they practiced that. And I just found that very interesting. All right, moving farther north, guys, up to the Arctic. So, like I said, we're going to be talking about northern Alaska and then parts of northern Canada. So not everywhere, but definitely as far north as you can go, where the Inuit lived. They usually lived in igloos, and these were homes made of ice and snow. I'm sure you guys have heard of this. Now, not everywhere in the Arctic did they live in igloos, and the only reason they did this, if you look around, there are no trees, guys. They're so far north that it gets too cold. There's an area that trees don't grow, and neither do plants. So the vegetation is very limited. So they rely on the source of snow and ice to create these igloos. Now, farther south in the Arctic, where trees did grow, they lived in different houses. And so this was really only up in the very far north. And people think that's so crazy. How could you live in a house made of snow and ice? I've tried it. My cousin and I were about your guys' age. We spent all day making an igloo. By the time we were done, we got in, and it was so warm on the inside because the snow works as insulation and it traps all your body heat in. It got so warm that we had to take off our snowmobile suits, our hats, our gloves. I mean, we were sweating. It was very cool. And they also could use oil lamps to help keep them warm. So, like I said, guys, the natural resources were very limited. It was so cold. Not a lot of plants grew in that area. So they had to use the resources that were around them. They were able to hunt foxes, caribou, which is like a larger deer, and even polar bears. And they used animal bones, if there weren't trees around, they used animal bones to make the frame of these kayaks. And what a kayak is, guys, it's just a smaller canoe. So they would use these animal bones and create this frame. So it would be a few bones that would go around probably 6 feet in length, 3 feet wide, and then they would take waterproof skins and stretch them around to create the exterior of this kayak. And then they were buoyant; they could float, and then they could use harpoons made out of wood if they had it, or made out of animal bone. And these harpoons were long spears that they used to hunt walruses and whales. And then, of course, they used ice and snow for homes and to drink. Here's just a quick picture, a little larger kayak because you've got two people in it. They are going out with their harpoons, trying to harpoon a whale on a whale hunt. And their culture was definitely a little different than most Native Americans because they didn't have resources. They wanted to share everything. Their extended family was super important. They helped make huge decisions that were good for everyone, and they usually shared after their hunting expeditions. They shared food with everyone, just because it was so very limited in that area that the only way they could survive is if they shared amongst everyone. And here's just a cool picture of an Inuit family, obviously bundled up because it is so cold. They could have used anything from polar bear fur, Arctic fox, whatever they found, whatever animal was there. They would have used their skins for clothing. And here's just a quick diagram. That far up north, it's very, very cold. So they might have two linings of clothing. The inner clothing, made of fur that would keep you warm. You might just wear this inside the igloo. But then when you're going outside, you're going to wear your outer clothing. That's a hooded jacket, warm mittens, trousers, boots that were very, very warm because your feet are always in contact with ice and snow. So these definitely helped the Native Americans in that area survive. And that is it, guys. So I hope you enjoyed this, and we'll talk to you soon.